Good afternoon, and welcome to MDIC's public forum on real-world evidence in the context of payer decision-making. We're really excited at MDIC to be hosting this event today, and we had over 200 attendees sign up. So we're very excited that this is clearly an important topic for all of us in today's environment. MDIC has had a health economics and patient value initiative for a few years now, but this is our first public forum, and we're really excited to share this with you today. If we can move to the next slide, I'll just do a brief summary of our agenda for today. And so we're going to be, after I tell you a little bit about MDIC, for those of you who don't know us, Joe Carroll Hyatt, who's our Vice President of Health Economics and Patient Value at MDIC, will go through more about that initiative, and then we'll move right into our amazing list of speakers for today. So really excited to share this with you and look forward to getting into the meat of the day. And with that, next slide. Next slide. Next. Thank you. So for those of you who don't know MDIC, the Medical Device Innovation Consortium is a fairly young organization. We're only 9 years old, but we are unique as a public-private partnership, bringing together the medical device industry along with diagnostics, several government agencies, and patient advocacy groups. And we're really excited to bring together these groups to really, the ultimate goal is to solve problems on behalf of patients. We have 63 member organizations and over 300 subject matter experts involved in our conversations on an array of issues. Next slide. So we're proud of the fact that MDIC has 3 different collaborative communities. FDA has made a priority, as have we, of having collaborative communities. And we have 3 currently and expect to add more, but currently our NEST collaborative community, our Case for Quality, and our digital pathology innovation. And these collaborative communities bring together partners from the academic medical centers, from the patient advocacy groups, and industry, government, and our own organization. So really excited to enhance the dialogue by bringing together a diverse array of stakeholders to problem solve together. Next slide. So our core initiatives, we talk about MDIC as having 4 main pillars. Really, when we started, we were purely regulatory science based, and so clinical science was core to who we were in our early days. We then added data science and technology to include external evidence methods, computational modeling, more recently cybersecurity and Case for Quality. The NEST Coordinating Center is now 3 years old, our National Evaluation System for Health Technology Coordinating Center. And the most recent one is our Health Economics and Patient Value, which is why, as the newest initiative, this is our first forum. Next slide. And so I'm just going to quickly run through these slides so you get a better sense of the array of activities. We do have a clinical diagnostics activity, which was significant for many reasons, but most recently that just before the pandemic hit, we had an emergency use authorization, international forum, and it was before EUA was a household term. And so we really appreciate the opportunity to be at the cutting edge of where the issues are and what's important to our community. Next slide. Early feasibility studies are another key area for us. What we've done over the last few years is brought more early feasibility studies back to US soil, where most of them have been done OUS, and we've put together a lot of tools and case studies to help facilitate this. Next slide. Our science of patient input, I believe that we all work to benefit patients first and foremost, and our science of patient input, first we worked on risk-benefit analysis that resulted in some FDA guidance. We've done a number of studies more recently to better understand the best ways to communicate benefit risk to patients, and doing some patient-centered outcome research. Next slide. Our case for quality is really one of the first initiatives that we started when we created MDIC 10 years ago, and our case for quality is really very core to, quality is core to everything all of us do, but being able to do a number of initiatives under this engages the entire community and makes quality front and center as opposed to just a necessary evil. Next slide. Our data science and technology, that's the old term for it. We're shifting that to digital health. We're going to be getting more and more involved in digital health. We have worked on modeling and simulation and external evidence for a number of years. We, in our cybersecurity initiative, we've added a threat modeling boot camp to get everybody up to speed on the cybersecurity threats and what to do about them. And we're looking at pathology innovation, 5G, and we're in the midst of exploring virtual reality. Next slide. And the whole reason all of us are here today is our health economics and patient value. We're really excited to have moved this initiative forward in the recent past to get not just the voice of industry and what industry's issues are with coverage and payment, but also what's important to patients, what's important to the payers, and how do we bring all of those different voices together to make sure that we're doing things in the best possible way. Next slide. And then our NEST Coordinating Center, and I could spend an hour just on this subject. Our National Evaluation System for Health Technology is really very core to what we're doing with real-world evidence at MDIC. As you can see, it was created in 2016, but we've come a long way in the last few years, have a system of network collaborators, have done a number of test cases, have created a collaborative community, and are now building a cloud infrastructure for active surveillance. Next slide. And that network that I just mentioned really covers roughly 161 million lives, and with a variety of data sources and so electronic health records is only one piece of that. And you can see this list of who our network collaborators are, which is how we have these different sources of data. Next slide. And so NEST has already published two main frameworks, our data quality framework and our research methods framework. We want to make sure that the data we're using is high quality and the methods of collecting data are accurate and usable for the users of that data. Next slide. So MDIC membership, we are a membership-based organization. We currently have over 60 members and are growing. And they come from a variety of different sources. And most notable is the fact that the tech community is interested, as we expand our digital health initiatives, are interested in becoming actively engaged. And we look forward to more active engagement from the payer community. Tamara Sarek-Jensen from CMS is on the MDIC board, as well as the NEST Governing Committee, and that's made a huge difference in our ability to move this particular initiative forward. Next slide. And so we're just going to quickly run through these 3 slides that show you who our members are. Next slide. And I believe there's one more. Oh. And so I'm really excited to now hand this meeting over to Jo Carol Hyatt, who is Vice President of Health Economics and Patient Value for MDIC. She has an extraordinary background, and we're very pleased to have her driving this initiative and hosting us today. With that, Jo Carol.
The health economics and patient value is a very exciting part of the MDIC. Oops, go back, please. Thank you. Organization, because it builds on an area that I am particularly passionate about, bringing the access to technologies to patients as quickly as we can, with careful review of the opportunities to gather information about the success, the safety, and building on what coverage and regulatory changes can be advanced through gathering real-world evidence, which is the purpose of today's meeting, and also the other part of the HEPV initiative really focuses on patient perspectives and bringing in their input and their recommendations regarding what risk tolerance they may have, trade-offs that they're willing to make. Next slide, please. It's not changing on my screen. Is that? Hello? There we go. Okay, sorry. So we have, it's a small part of MDIC, but growing. We have our steering committee that Jeff Farkas from Medtronic chairs, and the 2 work groups that we currently have are the Real World Evidence Work Group, which Jeff also chairs, and then the Patient Preference Research Work Group that Barry Leiden from Edwards Life Sciences chairs. Next slide, please. So these work groups, as mentioned, are working on these 2 areas. Next. And these slides will be available. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail, but again, really the Patient Preference Work Group is working with payers, health technology assessment organizations, and others to enhance the understanding of and incorporation of patient risk tolerances and preferences in trial design and selection of opportunities going forward. Next slide, please. And the Real World Evidence Work Group is the sponsor of today's session, and working to enhance the use, acceptability, incorporation of real-world evidence. Those of us that have spent time in the health technology assessment area know that clinical trials and double-blind randomized clinical trials, which are the gold standard, do have some gaps in what they can really accomplish. Things change once a technology is in a different environment with different populations, different providers. Next slide, please. And so we are very, very pleased to have the leaders of the FDA and CMS organizations that are most passionate about this work with us today. And it is a privilege to introduce Amy Abernethy, who is currently the Deputy Director and Chief Information Officer for FDA. I believe the final few days of her tenure with FDA. And in the short couple of years that Amy has been with FDA, her accomplishments are just extraordinary. When I read through her history, it was actually very embarrassing. We went to the same medical school, but beyond that, I don't share any of Amy's many, many accomplishments. In particular, I'd like to highlight her contributions to really creating a community around innovation and bringing a passion for that to FDA. So Amy, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. And thank you, Joe Carroll. Thank you, Pamela. And thank you for having me here with you to help kick off today's meeting. First slide, please. So as we get going, really want to highlight how personally important today's MDIC public forum is. This is a critical conversation that we've been advancing inside of FDA and certainly MDIC, and all of you have been advancing. And I'm very proud also of the work and very thoughtful and intentional discussions that FDA and CMS have had together. I personally want to also express my appreciation to Lee and Tamara. We have had some incredibly constructive discussions, and they've helped to align our thinking on real-world data and real-world evidence between the two operating divisions. And I'm also very hopeful that this forum is going to help us sustain the momentum and work going forward. I personally believe that modern real-world data has tremendous potential to accelerate the generation of high quality and actionable evidence for CMS and FDA and our decision making, and it will help to promote the access to important new technologies. Next slide, please. So, as we think about this, I also wanted to highlight that CMS and FDA have had an impressive history of working together to promote rapid access and evidence development. And we've benefited from real-world data from clinical registries. A great example is TVT, the Transcatheter Valve Therapy Registry, which produced critical data on the outcomes of this transcatheter aortic valve replacement as it was broadly adopted into clinical care. It helped to inform subsequent regulatory coverage and clinical decision-making. There were over 70 peer-reviewed journal articles that have been published from TVT. And this really has been a very critical step. However, as CMS noted in a recent coverage decision, they are aware that registries have extensive data entry requirements, and they are striving to strike an appropriate balance between reducing burden on providers and obtaining necessary data. Next slide, please. So that brings us to this space of modern real-world data. And as I think about modern real-world data, I recognize that high-quality real-world data is available from many other sources, including electronic medical records, wearable devices, laboratory reports, and others. And over the last decade, there's been rapid development of real-world data capabilities in the private tech sector, which raises the possibility that there may be opportunities to apply these new capabilities to generate evidence to address the gaps that exist at the time of product approval, or at least the gaps that may exist. And the intent is not to reduce the quality of the evidence generated, but rather to leverage newer real-world data approaches to potentially achieve equal or perhaps better quality evidence than with current approaches. Next slide. As we have encountered during the COVID-19 pandemic, we can leverage real-world data for many tasks, and we've gained tremendous insights and knowledge about the value of real-world data through sustained collaboration with public-private experts and stakeholders. We did this, for example, at FDA through the COVID-19 Evidence Accelerator that included the tech sector and data providers. And this kind of experience further reinforces my belief and many of our belief on this call that there's great potential for real-world data to inform and align FDA and CMS decisions with tremendous benefits for patients and public health. Last slide, please. And so we at FDA very much look forward to continuing the dialogue between FDA and CMS and with all of you. And this is going to help to align our thinking on how to best generate additional evidence, particularly for breakthrough and other high-value technologies. It's understood that defining how to best leverage real-world data to inform regulatory and payment decisions is going to require a sustained dialogue between FDA and CMS, as well as with product developers, clinicians, patients, payers, and other stakeholders. And today's forum is an important step. I appreciate this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing what happens. Thank you.
Great. I guess it's my turn. Am I live? Hello?
Yes, Dr. Fleischer, I think you're live.
Okay,
If you have
great.
any comments
So
to...
Yes, no, thank you very much.
Lee, it's Jo Carroll. I'm so sorry. We're having some technical challenges, and I did want to introduce you, but I was still muted. So Lee, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I have had the privilege of knowing Lee for a number of years. We were together on the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association Medical Advisory Panel, which is their health technology assessment organization led by Naomi Aronson. And so I know how thoughtful Lee is, how much he cares about quality, making sure that our patients are safe, and in his positions as chair of anesthesiology at Penn and other roles, which are very numerous. He's been a fantastic champion of quality. But for the last almost a year now, Lee has been the chief medical officer in the CMS, and there's a long name here, Center for Clinical Standards and Quality for the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. And we're very, very pleased to have Lee with us today. So thank you, Lee.
Great, and thank you. And I do not have any slides. And I really thank you, Jo Carroll. As you said, it's been a privilege. And I'll talk about what I learned from you in just a few minutes. And I really want to echo what Amy said, to thank you and Pamela for the invitation. And similar, I have my connection to Amy. She went to my undergrad just a few years later. Since I started at CMS, we've really been working hard at aligning CMS and FDA, and even before that, on our approach of using real-world data and evidence to gain FDA market approval. And CMS coverage is really a priority for myself, Tamara, and the agency. You know, I see many similarities to our sister agency, the FDA, in that we both really share a dual responsibility as a public health agency and a regulator. Sort of a unique thing to think of us as a payer, but we do have that role as a public health agency, which makes our relationship all the more important. That while the FDA certainly ensures that devices are safe and effective, that we are part of that continuum that asks about the issue of reasonable and necessary for our beneficiaries on the paying side. And one of the things that, going back to Jo Carroll and the work we did with Naomi, is it's really important for us to have clarity of what we need to make those decisions. That what I hope we will do through both real world evidence and the evidence of what can make us get to the answer of should we approve devices quickly because it's in the best interest of the patients that we serve, of who we need to have studies from, and what outcomes are we really looking at. And that, I think, is critically important and is our obligation. The FDA and CMS relationship has come a long way because of the hard work and commitment of Jeff Shuren and his team, as well as the team in the coverage advisory group, based on past successes such as coverage with evidency development, as Amy talked about, supporting post-approval studies. And the agencies are going to find a successful path forward with both real-world evidence and real-world decisions. That, in fact, we really put the public on notice that we're working closely with the FDA in our last decision, as Amy talked about, to find that right balance of not compromising our evidentiary standards, but investigating new, less burdensome ways or avenues of collecting and reviewing evidence for FDA and CMS coverage. And as Amy sort of pointed out with that figure of all the ways we can do it. I think in a similar way, what do we really need clinical data, as well as potentially in the future, data from personal devices. Very high standard, really, for something unique. When can we just go with claims and some enriched data? A great database is the SEER database for cancer. When can we just add a couple of laboratory data and add that to make some of our decisions about the safety, and not only safety and efficacy, which is certainly the FDA domain, but our domain of reasonable and necessary. And lastly, how do we stay with claims? Do we always need registries? Or if we're really monitoring post-market approval and continued demonstration of important effects in the Medicare beneficiaries, how can we use claims to assess the long-term outcomes? So our challenge today is really to leverage the lessons we've learned through coverage with evidence development and not ignore the technological advancements to find easier ways to utilize real-world data in a meaningful way for both CMS and FDA. So before I finish, I really want to take a few moments to thank Amy for her dedication to public service. I came in a year ago. We're really sad to see her departing as the FDA Deputy Commissioner. Her leadership and vision and working with our colleague, Sean Tunis, on how to leverage this data and technology to really improve the efficiency of clinical studies and really support a patient-centric dedication to care will be missed. So wishing you the best, and I look forward to really learning from how this group thinks, that through work with Tamara and the Coverage Advisory Group and Steve Farmer, who's presenting today, how we can ensure that really life-promoting technologies for our beneficiaries, and in many cases life-saving, get to them as quickly as possible. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Lee and Amy. We really appreciate your participation today, the commitment from both of you to the work that's underway. And Amy, we will definitely miss you, but look forward to seeing where you move on to and watch what benefits you bring to that new enterprise. So thank you very much. So would like to move on now. The next agenda item is the presentation. Felipe, thank you so much for joining us. The FDA published, I think it's now about a month ago almost, a review that is absolutely fascinating to look through of where in the last number of years real-world evidence has been applied in FDA. So Felipe, thank you.
Thank you, Joe Carroll. Next slide, please. So as Joe Carroll alluded to, about a month ago, we published a paper that included 90 or so illustrative examples of real-world evidence used in regulatory decisions. And I'd like to walk through those at a high level. The link to that paper was included in the agenda for this forum. So if you haven't had a chance to look through it, please do. Next slide. So let's start with the why. Why did FDA decide to publish these illustrative examples? Well, first of all, FDA is committed to advancing evidence generation with relevant and reliable real-world evidence across the total product lifecycle for timely regulatory decision-making. And what we wanted to do was showcase concrete examples to demonstrate that regulatory decisions can and have been made by CDRH based on real-world evidence. we wanted this to be a single place for stakeholders, to both internal and external, to see and learn from past experience. And the intent here is really to encourage the continued and expanded use of real-world evidence for regulatory decisions. Next slide, please. So a little background on what we did. The regulatory submissions spanning a number of years were reviewed, and about 90 examples that we thought were illustrative were taken from the public domain, information that's in the public domain, and included in this paper. It was accompanied by an FDA Voices piece about real-world evidence, which really highlighted the value and the spectrum of real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. Next slide, please. So how did we go about doing this? This was a very manual process, which has been a couple years in the making, certainly predates my arrival at the agency, and really was an effort led within the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis. It basically, the folks doing the analysis relied on flags available regarding the thousands of files that FDA reviews over the time spanned here, 2012 to 2019. And that was used to narrow the scope of what to search, and then painstakingly reviewed many submissions to identify the right example. So it's important to note that this paper and these examples that were included in the paper were not meant to be all-inclusive. There are more examples than the 90 included in the report, and they really relied upon being able to extract information that is already publicly available so as not to disclose information that shouldn't be disclosed. So as I mentioned, between 2012 and 2019, CDRH relied on real-world evidence to advance submissions that include a wide variety of submission types, 510K, pre-market notification, de novo applications, PMAs, and even HDEs. This included a variety of data sources. Amy mentioned in her talk the proliferation of data sources beyond registries. So it included data sources. There were a lot of registries, but also included medical records, claims, and device-generated data. And the regulatory decisions that were made based on this data was also varied. New authorizations, expanding indications and labeling, and fulfilling the requirements of a post-market study are some examples. They also come from a full continuum of clinical and device areas throughout all 7 offices of health technology within CDRH. Some examples are examples of digital health devices, validation of software as medical devices using real-world data. 2 examples that use patient-generated data, 9 which used device-generated data, and even 1 example where a clinical trial was embedded in a registry. Building on the learnings from this effort and others, we will continue to evaluate how real-world data and real-world evidence can be used efficiently to efficiently inform regulatory decision-making. So our intent is to continue to make case studies like this available on a periodic basis. Next slide, please. Some additional case examples include a 510K for modification of label for a hemodialysis catheter, NCAP, to include information related to reduction of bloodstream infections, a de novo for a next-gen sequencing-based tumor profiling test with EHR data, and a PMA for a total ankle replacement system that used registry data as a primary source of data for a pre-market approval, and then subsequently to support a post-approval study as a condition of approval. Next slide, please. So in the next 3 slides or so, I'm going to present some very simple graphs that give you an idea of how these are categorized here by submission type. And you can see that the most prevalent submission type in which represented in these examples are either PMAs or panel track PMA supplements. But there were also 510Ks that relied upon clinical data, de novos, which often rely on clinical data, as well as HDEs, as you can see here. Next slide, please. Broken down by data source, here you can see a variety of sources that were used. Again, the registries, whether a sponsor registry or non-sponsor registry, accounted for 40%, give or take. And beyond that, medical records accounted for about 21% of the examples. But really the takeaway from this slide is that it isn't just registries. We have seen and have made decisions based on more real-world data sources that were deemed to be both reliable and relevant. Next slide, please. Here you have, we broke down the pre-market cases by how the data itself was used. And you can see in one case it was used as a comparator for a clinical trial. In others, it was used as a control. In several instances, it was used to demonstrate substantial equivalence, and labeling expansion and new indications were by far the biggest use in the pre-market space. And then broken down by whether it was used on its own versus as a primary source versus as a supplement to traditional clinical trial data. The graph on the right shows that in many instances, 12 of the 65 pre-market cases, it was the sole source of data on which the decision was made. And in 39 cases, it was the primary source. There are many instances where multiple data sources are combined, and that includes combining the real-world evidence with traditional clinical trial. And that's how we categorize whether it was primary or a secondary or supplementary source on the right side of the graph. Next slide, please. So I've gone into, obviously not the detail that the paper goes into, but I've gone into more detail in categorizing the examples and giving you an idea of what the intent was and how the examples were curated. But let's take a step back here. What are some take-home messages? I think the most important one is that decisions based on real-world evidence are not new to CDRH. Some examples predate our real-world evidence guidance, and we absolutely saw an upward trend in the use of real-world evidence. Not a scientific sampling or random sampling of submissions, but this is an anecdotal increase that I think reflects what we all expect will continue to happen going forward. For each of the examples published, CDRH assessed the relevance and reliability of the real-world evidence and determined that it was acceptable in evaluating the totality of the available data. Now, this as I mentioned, the time period within the scope of the examples included in the paper predated the real-world guidance, real-world evidence guidance document that CDRH published, expressing its thinking on relevance and reliability, but implicitly, those were the sorts of considerations that reviewers were making in the submissions that predated that guidance document. It's also important to note that the 90 examples only included information that's available in the public domain. So you can imagine all the examples in the paper are positive examples that led to approval, since FDA does not publish disapproval decisions, et cetera. So there are examples where the data was found to be not relevant and reliable, but we're unable to share those. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about the relevance and reliability and data quality. So relevance, as I mentioned, is a critical component of CDRH's review of submissions that rely on real-world evidence. And in all 90 examples, it was established and largely dependent on the context of use. Basically, the degree of relevance that was required depended on whether it was meant to inform, say, a clinical study design or establish substantial equivalence or make pre-market benefit risk determinations, or if it's to be used for post-market studies or post-market surveillance. So a real-world evidence study and the patient population and the endpoints and duration of follow-up depend largely on that context of use. And next slide, please. These are the types of decisions that FDA CDRH makes. And I won't speak for the payers in the room, but I would think that the ability to use real-world evidence and whether it's considered relevant to the context of use, there may be a different point where for reimbursement or coverage decisions, that data is considered to be relevant. That standard may be and is expected to be different from the standards that CDRH needs to use based on its regulations. Next slide, please. So that's the case for reliability. For relevance. For reliability and data quality, which are also critical components of CDRH review, I think it's a little bit different. Data that is of poor quality will likely not be usable for decision making, regardless of the relevance and regardless of the purpose. Now, that's not to say that there isn't wiggle room to make decisions on less than perfect quality data. But if I would pose that there is a line below which the quality will make the data not usable. And for this reason, we believe that well-defined standards for real-world data quality are absolutely critical, so that they can be applied consistently within the medical device ecosystem, so that we can leverage data sources for multiple purposes, and just so that we have a common understanding of what good looks like. To this end, FDA is working with MDIC, NEST, and other stakeholders to develop metrics, maturity models, as was alluded to earlier. But we're also striving toward setting developing standards for data quality that the medical device ecosystem can rely upon. With that, that's the end of my presentation. Next slide. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity for sharing some high-level comments on these examples and encourage you to take a look for yourself following the link that's in the agenda.
Felipe, thank you so much. If we could bring Stephen on camera as well. So I just want to remind the audience that if you have questions, please submit them in the chat or the submit question on the platform. We will get to as many as we can later. And as Felipe mentioned, we're really excited about the opportunity to incorporate real-world evidence in coverage decisions, and very happy to have Dr. Steve Farmer with us from CMS to talk about their perspective. Steve, thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today about CMS's perspective on the role of real-world evidence in coverage determination. I'll then review the recently published TIER NCD to illustrate how evidence gaps may remain after the FDA market authorization. Lastly, I'll show how CMS considered real-world evidence in expanding TIER coverage for the functional mitral regurgitation indication. First, I'd like to talk about how CMS views innovation as holding tremendous promise to improve our beneficiaries' health. CMS aims to bring proven technologies to our patients as efficiently as possible. I'm a practicing cardiologist, and there are numerous examples that come to mind from my field. But for patients, for our patients, I want to just walk through a couple of examples, and I think they illustrate how innovation can be beneficial. So for patients who have refractory angina that requires revascularization, angioplasty and stenting offers a really effective solution. It also avoids the risks and prolonged recovery attendant with coronary artery bypass grafting. This is a really old example, but for appropriately selected Medicare beneficiaries with multiple comorbidities, it was a huge advance. And over my career, the technology and the associated medications have advanced together to improve outcomes. So too have its appropriate applications as we've learned more about the strengths and limitations of PCI. And I think there's a theme there that the evidence and appropriate use of technologies can change over time as we learn more about them and as ancillary treatments also develop and improve. For eligible patients with severe heart failure, despite maximally tolerated guideline-directed medical therapy, cardiac resynchronization therapy can provide nearly immediate relief. CRT also prevents heart failure admissions, improves quality of life, and extends survival. It is especially notable because unlike some other treatments for refractory advanced heart failure, CRT also improves the efficiency of the heart without adding further stress to a damaged heart muscle. Even so, despite its promise, evidence emerged over years about which patients stand to benefit from CRT and which ones actually don't end up benefiting from it. And those altered the way that it's been applied in real-world use and where it's most appropriate and valuable for patients. Outside of cardiology, next-generation sequencing comes to mind. NGS is a diagnostic tool for patients with advanced cancer. It can help to identify patients with certain genetic mutations that may benefit from targeted therapies and can assist patients and their oncologists in making more informed treatment decisions. There are many excellent examples, and in many of them, as I said, the evidence evolves over time long after FDA market authorization. CMS also recognizes that the journey from concept to bedside can be a long and challenging one for innovators, and we continue to seek out opportunities to decrease regulatory complexity and reduce innovator burden. For example, the Center for Medicare recently underwent a reorganization, including the establishment of the new Technology, Coding, and Payment Group. The intent was to streamline coding and payment processes, and CAG is also working closely with TCPG to improve coordination on coverage as well. The recently published Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technologies rule is on hold while it is being reviewed by the Biden administration. I can't speak about that today, but I can speak to our interest in streamlining coverage with evidence development to reduce burden. As Amy Abernathy mentioned, we alluded to that issue in our recent coverage decision for TIER. We recognize that while registries can be incredibly valuable, they can also impose significant burdens on institutions and providers. And we continue to work to explore opportunities to refine coverage with evidence development in ways that can integrate both some custom collected data as well as some that is derived from registries. The Heart Valve Collaboratory is a public-private partnership sponsored by the FDA to address various issues in the heart valve space. And I was really very appreciative of the work and the effort that the HVC invested in streamlining the case report form to help preserve CED as a coverage option for TEER for transcatheter edge-to-edge repair. Through their efforts, the number of required variables in the case report form was dramatically reduced for both TEER and TAVR beginning at the beginning of this year. And through careful collaboration with numerous stakeholders, HVA accomplished that reduction in burden without undermining the registry's value and preserving the quality of the data. The 2015 Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act legislation, or MACRA, was a watershed moment in U.S. healthcare policy that reflects a durable bipartisan commitment to value-based payment policy. The law intends to change the way that Medicare pays for services and to reward clinicians for value over volume. The value equation integrates both quality and cost considerations, but you cannot achieve value without demonstrating improvements in patient outcomes. Therefore, evidence-based coverage is at the center of CMS's value mission, and devices must deliver proven benefits to Medicare beneficiaries. CMS has long established and rigorous evidence standards, and we previously published guidance on that, on those methodological principles of study design. Those principles are referenced in all of our coverage decisions as well, if you want to look for them. High quality randomized controlled trials and controlled trials are important to establish that items and services can improve health outcomes, but they are often conducted at major medical centers with a very carefully and narrowly selected patient population. At the time of FDA market authorization, more evidence is often needed to demonstrate that devices provide improved outcomes for Medicare beneficiaries who are often over 65 and have multiple comorbidities. More evidence may also be needed to demonstrate that RCT outcomes can be replicated under real-world conditions. Many devices have significant evidence gaps relative to the CMS reasonable and necessary standard at the time of FDA market authorization. These gaps are especially notable for breakthrough devices where the FDA allows for greater uncertainty at the time they are authorized. The FDA allows for greater uncertainty because breakthrough devices address an unmet clinical need or offer considerable advantages relative to existing treatments. The FDA recognized that allowing greater uncertainty shifts some evidence development needs from the pre-market to the post-market time period. Real-world evidence has considerable promise to effectively address those evidence gaps in the post-market period, but studies that rely on real-world evidence will be held to the same rigorous evidentiary standards as conventional studies are. Real-world data may be derived from multiple sources, but most commonly they come from administrative claims, electronic health records, and registries. In the future, other variables may be derived from wearables and smartphone applications as well, and it will be crucial for us to assure that those additional data elements are valid and reliable when they become available. As a core principle, variables derived from these sources must be consistently captured, valid, and reliable. Important outcomes must be observable in the data and must be clear-cut. In other words, outcomes in real-world evidence generally can't be outcomes that require committee adjudication, as may be the case in some clinical studies. CMS recently codified the definition of reasonable and necessary in regulation. CMS has not yet established how commercial payment policy will be incorporated into the definition, so I will defer a discussion of commercial payers for another time and focus on the longstanding definition that's been in the Medicare Administrative Contractor Manual. The criteria make clear that Medicare expressly considers whether devices are appropriate for our beneficiaries, and that they are furnished in accordance with accepted standards of medical practice. These considerations represent important distinctions from the FDA requirement that devices are safe and effective. Especially for novel devices, there may not be a clear medical practice standard at the time of FDA market authorization, for example, especially if no similar treatment has previously been available in the market. CMS also considers the appropriate circumstances in which the device should be offered, including considerations like the required expertise of the providers who order and furnish the device and the setting in which it is offered. These elements may be considered by the FDA, but are often not included in the FDA labeling, and they really matter. There are many examples where treatments fail to provide the expected benefit if they are offered by the wrong providers in the wrong context or to the wrong patient groups. Now I'm moving to the transcatheter edge-to-edge repair example. The recently published National Coverage Determination for Transcatheter Edge-to-Edge Repair, or TEER, for treatment of functional mitral regurgitation illustrates many of these points. It also demonstrates how CMS already considers real-world evidence in our coverage decisions. Briefly, TEER is a treatment for a dysfunctional mitral heart valve that is causing significant symptoms despite maximally tolerated medical therapy. The alternative treatment for FMR is open heart surgery, but the core problem for patients with functional mitral regurgitation is advanced heart failure and not failure of the valve itself. While surgery may alleviate symptoms, these patients are very high surgical risk, and there's no evidence that surgical valve repair improves survival. Consequently, there's been tremendous interest in identifying non-surgical and less invasive options to treat these patients and alleviate their symptoms. So moving to evidence reviewed for the TEER NCD slide, TEER was already covered for degenerative MR, which is a circumstance where the valve itself is damaged, and the reconsideration expanded coverage to mitral regurgitation resulting from heart failure. For the reconsideration, we performed a systematic literature review that identified 2 randomized controlled studies, 25 observational studies, and 3 meta-analyses. We also reviewed expert guideline and consensus documents on heart failure management, mitral valve disease, and transcatheter edge-to-edge repair. Lastly, we participated in an NIH convening that brought together experts from around the world from multiple disciplines to discuss the role of TEER in functional mitral regurgitation treatment. We took this added step because there is so much controversy around the benefits of TEER in FMR. Now moving to slide 8, conflicting randomized controlled study results. 2 randomized controlled trials of TEER in functional mitral regurgitation were published in the same 2018 New England Journal edition. The first was the COAPT study, which found very substantial benefit for TEER in terms of hospitalization for heart failure, all-cause mortality, and quality of life. The second was MITRA-FR, which found no benefit at all and even suggested a non-statistically significant trend towards harm in these patients. Although there were differences between the 2 studies, they both ostensibly enrolled the same patient population of moderate to severe mitral regurgitation with advanced heart failure. Though one followed, the COAPT study followed patients for 2 years, and MITRA-FR followed patients for 1 year. The discrepancy between the 2 trials led 2 preeminent heart valve experts to write that it's difficult to reconcile the differences in patient outcomes between these 2 studies. The FDI relied heavily on the COAPT study in granting market authorization for TEER for the FMR indication, and that point is evident in their labeling. Even so, CMS sees the promise of TEER to improve outcomes for patients with FMR, but the MITRA-FR study illustrates that COAPT outcomes may not be replicated under real-world conditions. So CMS concluded that TEER was beneficial only with carefully selected patients and when offered at larger medical centers with a full complement of experienced providers. Moving to generalizability to Medicare beneficiaries. Returning to the CMS reasonable and necessary criteria, recall that a core consideration for CMS is whether there's evidence that devices are appropriate for Medicare beneficiaries. Central to that assessment is whether there is evidence of benefit in our population, where that device should be furnished and by whom. If we focus solely on the COEP trial, the average patient age was 72, so Medicare beneficiaries were almost certainly represented in the study cohort generally. But the COEP study highlights the critical importance of patient selection. Only 42% of patients referred for randomization ultimately met enrollment criteria. Furthermore, nearly a third did not have their MR severity validated after review by an echo core laboratory. So clearly, if you put this technology into the wild without any kind of close observation, there's concern that you would not generate the outcomes that were observed in the COEP study. To isolate the effects of TIR on FMR outcomes, the COEP study excluded a long list of comorbidities as well. Many of them are commonly associated with moderate or severe MR and advanced heart failure, so they're often present in patients who might want to pursue TIR. For example, severe pulmonary hypertension, severe tricuspid regurgitation, and right heart failure are often present as a result of the patient's MR. So having them be excluded comorbidities is problematic for sure. If we rely entirely on the COEP study, we cannot know if patients with those excluded comorbidities would benefit from the intervention. Moving to slide on real-world evidence provided insight into the discrepant findings. So randomized controlled trials and controlled trials are the top of the evidence hierarchy that CMS has articulated in our methodologic considerations. And many times, RCTs and controlled trials offer the most compelling evidence of benefit. But in this case, the findings of COEP and MITRA-FR were entirely discrepant. When comparing the two trials, CMS concluded that medical therapy was more aggressive and MR was worse in the COEP study relative to MITRA-FR. Physicians and facilities were able to participate in MITRA-FR after experience with only 5 procedures, which led us to believe that MITRA-FR may have been a challenge because of insufficient experience. Many patients referred for COEP did not meet inclusion criteria, as I mentioned just a moment ago. And lastly, COEP followed patients for 24 months, and the survival curves diverged after a year. So you may not have seen a survival benefit in MITRA-FR because they weren't followed for long enough. In summary, CMS concluded that experience is crucial to both patient selection and to procedural success. Even so, given the uncertainty about why these trials reached such different conclusions, CMS relied on real-world evidence, which came largely from Europe. The European observational studies used a variety of data sources ranging from records drawn from a single institution to registry data drawn from multiple institutions and countries. Some observational studies linked multiple data sources, including an echocardiography database and electronic health record data to study these patients. These observational data reflect less meticulously selected patients and delivered TIR under a broader range of conditions and at a broader range of facilities with perhaps less trained providers than was true in the COEP study. And that gave us greater confidence that we could rely on COEP outcomes to provisionally provide coverage for this. Even so, CMS concluded, while we concluded that the COEP outcomes were broadly consistent with the observational studies and meta-analyses in terms of enrolled patients and one-year survival outcomes, if we move to the next slide, we ultimately concluded that it should be covered under coverage with evidence development. So ultimately, after careful consideration of all of the available evidence, including RCTs, controlled trials, and the real-world evidence generated observational studies from Europe, CMS covered TEER for FMR through CED. We concluded that clinical controversy remains about the benefits of TEER for FMR and whether outcomes are durable beyond 24 months. So under the CED pathway, all TEER procedures must be entered into a qualified registry. CMS highlighted 5 questions that we hope will be addressed through the data gathered. Each of them is directly tied to the evidence deficits that we reviewed in the reconsideration. Those questions address, for example, what are the appropriate standards for facilities, operators, and heart teams? What is the relative benefit of TEER in various subpopulations of FMR, such as those with various excluded comorbidities? Is there evidence confirming the theory of disproportionately severe MR in the COAP study? And what is the role of guideline-directed medical therapy after TEER? And lastly, we wanted evidence that the durability of the intervention persisted beyond 24 months. And once those questions and those evidence gaps have been sufficiently addressed, we can reconsider whether ongoing CED is required. So moving to conclusions, so to wrap up, the key takeaways from this presentation are that the FDA and CMS have distinctive missions and must follow different regulations and decision-making. The FDA is charged with establishing the devices are safe and effective, while CMS must establish that they are reasonable and necessary. The CMS reasonable and necessary standard is based on demonstration of improved outcomes in Medicare beneficiaries. Because of these differences, many devices have significant evidence gaps relative to CMS's RNN criteria at the time of FDA market authorization. For example, many studies rely on intermediate outcomes, lack sufficient enrollment of Medicare beneficiaries, and study patients over a relatively short time frame. CMS believes that real-world evidence has promised to close at least some of those gaps and may do so very efficiently. The field is advancing rapidly, and we expect it will present new opportunities. We look forward to working with the FDA and other stakeholders to identify real-world evidence applications that close the evidence gap while preserving the quality of evidence that CMS requires. We also note that, as I illustrated in the TEER example, CMS already considers real-world evidence in our decision-making and will continue to do so in the future. I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to present today.
Now, thank you so much, Steve. That was terrific. And we have a really interesting hypothetical example that will illustrate the questions that Steve has brought up here. So CMS certainly is a significant payer in the U.S. healthcare market, but of course, many of us receive our healthcare through other health plans, and we're very happy that John Whitney was available today. John comes from Anthem and has a tremendous experience in the decisions behind how commercial plans view real-world evidence. So, John, thank you for joining us today.
Joe Carroll, thank you, and thanks to the other presenters. It's been very interesting. I'm really impressed, actually, that we're more or less on time so far today. So quite a few slides that we've gotten through very efficiently. So I didn't make any slides for this presentation, just a few comments that I'll make about Anthem. First, Anthem is a large private payer. We have Medicare Advantage plans, Medicaid plans, and commercial blue plans in 14 different states, really a 50-state operation. I oversee Anthem's medical policy team and process, and so we develop and maintain the medical policies used on behalf of Anthem members where applicable. For example, Medicare Advantage relies on the Medicare-derived coverage decisions. So we apply consistent criteria and approaches and standards to Anthem determinations of medical necessity. We publish our criteria on the internet. It's available for free. You just have to go to anthem.com and figure out how to get to the medical policy page, which they've enhanced it, so it's a lot easier maybe than it once was. And we look at evidence through the same lens, and we don't say, oh, this one's real world. We're not going to consider it. But we have some some phrases that we think about when we're evaluating evidence. And, for example, like credible scientific evidence, published in peer-reviewed literature, that that has been the service under review, could be a device, could be a drug, could be a diagnostic, is proven material to improve the net health outcomes. So that's a balance of risks and benefits, harms and benefits. It should be as good as any established alternative. It doesn't have to be any better, but at least as good. And it should show improvement outside investigational settings. And I think real world evidence has a lot of, opportunity to help enhance some of the scenarios that we encounter where, a device has been FDA approved or cleared. Oftentimes it's not, more and more we see things that, don't necessarily have a formal approval, but are out in the market anyway, often, 510K device with a predicate device, which has almost nothing to do with the device or the use that's being promoted for the device that's now been cleared as, okay for the marketplace. And in many situations, particularly when it's not a PMA type device, that, the level of evidence is severely lacking. And, often no randomized controlled trials, not much in the way of credible evidence. And even like the journals that you'll see some of the studies published in support, are journals that, don't really score highly in the rating systems of, journals that generate, meaningful market presence. And so, we look at all those factors. We don't exclude things maybe simply because they weren't published in a US journal, but all of those things come into play when we say, is this credible scientific evidence? And so, again, that same lens is applied to things which are, so-called real world evidence. Is the publication free of bias? And, that in all of its various forms. What methodologic limitations might be present? Is it large enough? Is it long enough? And of course, none of those are subjective. There's no, it must have, 48 months of follow-up, or it must have 250 people in it. There's no, it's very situational, but for any given service, it should be large enough and long enough, and for very common conditions. So we'll see things come through for conditions like atrial fibrillation or various cardiac maladies, which are unfortunately very common in the general population. And, you'll see the accumulated evidence of 50 people, So it's hard to draw generalizable conclusions about the population with the condition when you have such little in the way of published evidence. So if you can get sort of through the construct of it, being reasonably free of bias and methodologically sound, you sort of ask, well, what are they measuring? And all too often, again, we see, for all sorts of reasons, some good, some bad, surrogate measures of outcomes where we have, indirect or chain of logic type arguments being made that, because it improves this, it must improve that, and therefore it's clinically meaningful. And, sometimes those are quite valid and really well worked out. I think you can think of things like, hypertension and LDL cholesterol as two surrogates that are reasonably well agreed upon. Hemoglobin A1C also, although all three of those have their limitations in terms of their predicting the outcomes of interest for the conditions, in consideration. I think clinically relevant outcomes, but also clinically meaningful outcomes and results. And so, again, independent of whether it's real world or so-called, what is a RCT? Is that not real world? I'm not sure, but I think it's still real world. It just happens to also be an RCT. So evidence of any kind, ought to have clinically meaningful outcomes. And I think sometimes when I look at some of the studies, that are purported to be real world, the methodologic gymnastics that occur in the publications to generate, conclusions that it's meaningful are dense and impenetrable to the point of not really being understandable. And so different, we're going to hear a little bit about some proposed methodologies for real world evidence for causation later today. And some of those things, they're very interesting, and very plausible, but nevertheless, when you start to build in models and assumptions, and those assumptions sort of generate their own sub-paper within the paper that's linked out in a E-only appendix that then links into, it gets very difficult to penetrate a study. And, the conclusion that something is a clinically meaningful benefit becomes more and more difficult to arrive at when, you have to get there through a lot of different maneuvers such as that. Anthem as a company also actually publishes real world evidence. We have a subsidiary, HealthCore, and I work with that team all the time, and we look at topics. And it is something that's very important to us as we do that, is that we treat these questions just like in RCT. We have, committees that review topic suggestions. We develop formal hypotheses before we set up, the search, protocol within the databases that we have, and we have lab data, EHR data, obviously claims data, but we're very, very careful methodologically to set these up so that they're done properly and avoid sort of the data searching for a positive result type of experience that many people remain concerned about in the so-called real world evidence forum. The other thing about real world evidence is that, it's a two-way street, and I am looking forward to the day with a negative study and says, hey doc, we did this RWE study on our device and it was negative, so we're going to ask you to remove coverage for it. The questions only come one way, and that doesn't, that's back to the question of bias, publication bias that exists, where the only things that get put out there or are argued about, are those that are positive or show the outcome that the particular entity might be interested in promoting. So I think that, you have to look at real world evidence and ask yourself why it seems that it only seemingly has positive results. But I know that's not entirely true, so I'm being a little bit pressing there, but doing that purposely for the purpose of this session today. And the last thing, I think, Felipe Aguel, summarized it so well. And I think one of the things that the real opportunity for me, is I don't set the standards. What is good RWE? What is not good RWE? But I do think we need, a common language around this, that there are strong and well-defined standards, and that we do have a common agreement on what good looks like, because I think that goes a long way towards getting us into the parts of the process that I think are really important, which gets back to that clinically meaningful, clinically relevant type outcomes, and not focus too much on the methodology itself. And I think that's actually, in my career with Anthem, which is spanning 20 years now, it's really come a long way in some of the discussions about methodology. And I think MDIC as an entity has been a leader in that. And I look forward to continuing the conversation and enhancing the information sets that I have and I use as I represent Anthem in making decisions about what we consider medically necessary and so on. So, Joe Carola, those are my comments for today. Thank you very much, and we'll talk again later.
Thanks so much, John. And your comment about a negative result from real world evidence, that you never see those. I, as you know, spent a number of years in the Kaiser Permanente organization, and we did get some negative results. But I think the point is really interesting, that once a technology has been made available, is covered, then that is very, very difficult to withdraw from clinical practice and clinical use. So as I mentioned, this next part is hopefully somewhat entertaining, if nothing else. I want to thank Steve Farmer for all the work he did to create this example. This is a hypothetical and being used for illustration purposes. So if we could go to the next slide, please. This is from Acme Medical Devices, a fully capable, fully functional artificial pancreas. It's implanted. That avoids a lot of the benefit category durable medical equipment issues that I wanted to skip. Next, please. And is it possible? I'm seeing a version that the slides are very small. Let me see if I can make that larger for me. So Acme Medical is based in Springfield and has a significant market cap, a lot of investment from venture capitalists, and is in the diabetes management, CRM, and orthopedic business. Next, please. There are a lot of individuals with type 1 diabetes who require insulin, which has significant risks of management challenges as well as complications from the condition itself, with significant disabilities that can ensue. I'm going to go through these quickly. Next, please. So this artificial hypothetical example is everybody's dream for the management of diabetes. It is, as I said, fully implanted. The insulin and glucagon reservoirs are accessible with a weekly refill option or as needed. The device knows when it's running low or is not in need of an additional supplement of medication, so that can be customized to whatever is needed. It connects to a smartphone app, which provides all sorts of information for the recipient, as well as communicating with the healthcare providers and others who are involved in managing the care of this individual. It's expected to last 10 years. It can be recharged, just like some of the current phones that you just put on a pad and they recharge themselves. So there's a device that can be placed over the port site or the implant site on the abdominal wall, which will recharge it. And it synchronizes with everything and sends all kinds of information, including the current glucose levels. And it identifies when the patient may have a low glucose level and can deliver a rescue dose of glucagon, which for those of you that don't take care of diabetics, this is similar to a Narcan rescue for a drug overdose. It can avoid a significant hypoglycemic event or low sugar complications. Next, please. So this is convenient. It's obviously much better for active lifestyles. It has predictive analytics from the data that it's gathered that can anticipate that the patient will be going to the gym at a certain time typically, and prepare for that with appropriate reduction in insulin where that would be needed, as well as the patient could indicate that they're going to go a bit off their usual routine at Thanksgiving and have some anticipatory adjustments for that. So all kinds, everything you can dream of that you might want for the care of this population, including preventive care for their visual screening, flu shots, anything else that may be appropriate. Next. And there are trials that have been done to demonstrate the effectiveness of the therapy. There were comparison group with self-administered insulin versus the implanted device. And go to the next slide. Shows the data from this, where the artificial pancreas performed extremely well compared to manual insulin. The results show that the percent of time that the patients were in the ideal range was significantly improved, as well as fewer events where there was significant hyperglycemia. And the hemoglobin A1C, which is a metric for overall glucose management, was improved over the control group. And a handful of adverse events that are shown here, but nothing terribly serious. Next. So the major complications, there was one surgical. Minor complications were the majority of the problems, with the requirement to reboot or a calibration error. Next. And this is the other trial that was submitted for FDA consideration, with multi-center trial, international, not just US, and some similar results. We'll go to the next slide. And this shows, again, that the artificial pancreas performed well. The groups were similar demographically. This one did not have as much improvement in the hemoglobin A1C, but it did show a better control than the manual insulin administration population. And again, similar hemoglobin A1C, did have more adverse events. Next. So the FDA labeling allows for use of this device with some of the components separate if necessary or appropriate for that individual. But this is the labeling that was produced. And I want to remind everybody, this is hypothetical. I wish this thing existed, but it does not. Next. So these are the data that are presented at the time of the FDA authorization. And now, how would CMS look at this, and how could real-world evidence perhaps address some of the issues that CMS identifies? Steve, you're up.
Thank you, Jo Carroll. So in this next segment, CMS will react to the data presented by the manufacturer and identify some important considerations. Next slide. So when reviewing any new device for CMS coverage, CMS addresses a series of questions. CMS's defined benefit program and devices must have a benefit category determination to be eligible for payment under our authority. So for the purpose of this discussion, let's just stipulate that the device and all of its associated services are covered and have a BCD. Next, CMS will review the available evidence to determine if it meets their reasonable and necessary threshold. If it does, it may be eligible for a national or local coverage determination. For those devices that have promising evidence of benefit but do not yet meet the reasonable and necessary threshold, CMS identifies which evidence gaps remain, and historically, CMS has been able to cover devices in that category through that category of context through coverage with evidence development as a pathway. I reviewed the reasonable and necessary definition previously, so I'm presenting it here again briefly just for reference and as a refresher. As I mentioned previously, CMS focuses heavily on the third criteria in our evidence reviews, that the device is appropriate for Medicare beneficiaries. Considerations include that it is consistent with accepted practice standards, furnished in an appropriate setting by qualified personnel, meets but does not exceed the patient's medical need, and is as least as beneficial as an existing alternative treatment. Next slide. So environmental scan of the artificial pancreas. So in this completely hypothetical example, there it is again, hypothetical, there were two pivotal clinical trials, the Sweet Relief and the Crush Diabetes studies. CMS also reviewed evidence on related technologies, including continuous glucose monitors and insulin pumps generally, in support of its review of this new implanted pancreas, artificial pancreas. The available evidence suggests a meaningful improvement in glucose control, but neither of the two RCTs that we just discussed examined hard outcomes or patient preferences, and the longest study was 24 months. For a device that's fully implanted and requires surgery, that's a very short follow-up period, and certainly they would want to see a longer time horizon. Few Medicare beneficiaries also were included with very low percentages, and no racial or ethnic data was presented as well. So we would want to see evidence of that too. Now moving to the CMS Gap Analysis. So after reviewing the evidence, CMS concludes that the device did not meet the RNN threshold and important evidence gaps remain. This is a brief discussion, so I'm just going to focus on the very biggest points. We'll focus on 3 areas. The first is the device needs to demonstrate that it improves heart outcomes and potentially improves patient, addresses patient preferences. Is this something that patients value? For example, does it demonstrate a reduction in cardiovascular events and renal failure? Does it show a reduction in ED visits or hospitalizations? Does it demonstrate improved patient self-efficacy or quality of life as meaningful outcomes and rather than intermediate outcomes? Secondly, the longest trial was 24 months. This is an implanted device, and we would like to see a longer time frame to demonstrate the device is durable, that it doesn't have problems, that it doesn't have glitches that require explantation or device failure. And thirdly, the data are poorly generalizable to Medicare beneficiaries in their current status, and therefore we would like to see more Medicare beneficiaries included, as well as racial and ethnic minorities, to demonstrate that those groups also benefit from this intervention. And that was the gap analysis slide. We're going to shift to the next segment here, and we'll now hear from 2 discussants on their reactions to the device and how they might use real-world evidence to address CMS-identified evidence gaps. Our 2 speakers represent 2 distinct methodologic backgrounds, and I look forward to hearing their thoughts. Our first speaker will be Dr. Sebastian Schneeweiss, who is a professor of medicine and epidemiology at Harvard Medical School and chief of the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology in the department at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. He'll be followed by Bernie Black, who is a professor at both the Pritzker School of Law and Kellogg School of Management, both at Northwestern University. So back to you, Dr. Schneeweiss.
Well, thank you very much for setting this up so beautifully, Joe, Carol, and Steve. My name is Sebastian Schneeweiss, and I'm a pharmacoepidemiologist, not a device epidemiologist. I guess I was invited to share a little bit what we are doing with regard to real-world evidence in the pharmaceutical space and how this translates into device epidemiology. The most important difference between pharmaco and device epi is that in pharmaco we have repeat exposures. You fill medications over and over again, and you have a choice to fill or not to fill. While in device epidemiology, most of the time it's implanted and it's in until it fails or whatever happens, right? So there are some similarities, and I'm going to share that. If you would go on to the next slide, slide 87, we have my disclosures here. Since this is recorded, you can look over that at your leisure time. If you go to slide number 88, just to set the stage, when we say real-world data, and the FDA in their framework document has a definition for that, which are data that are generated through the routine operation of the healthcare system. So first and foremost, there are claims data and electronic health record data, but also other recordings, wearable devices, and things like that. What you see in this slide at the top is kind of an ongoing data stream as these data that are getting generated by the operation of the healthcare system are getting recorded, and just these databases are getting bigger and bigger, and they grow second by second as more information is added to this. And what you have, these little spaghetti lines in this bigger arrow, which should indicate a database. Each spaghetti line is a single patient. The beauty of these data, and this is what I want to highlight on this slide, is that you have a longitudinal, individual patient level recording of all the encounters with the professional healthcare system. And in claims data, then you have information on diagnoses. These are billing diagnoses, these are discharge diagnoses. You have information on procedure codes, what kind of medical procedures, interventions were conducted. You might have information on the unique device identifier, the UDIs, you know exactly what type of device was implanted, or CPT codes on a slightly higher level, information, what devices were used. And of course, the beauty of these types of data is that you can have very long-term follow-up, particularly in Medicare, which is largely a consuming state. Once you're Medicare, you stay in Medicare unless you spend down to Medicaid. So we have very long follow-up potentially in Medicare beneficiaries looking at these claims data. Within those longitudinal individual level data streams, you then implement a study, you do your analysis, and then hopefully, if you have a causal study design, a causal analysis, you will come to causal conclusions. That's what we want. We want to make causal conclusions on the effectiveness and safety of the medical device of interest. Next slide, please. Now, how this works is that you have a study question, you have specified objectives, and Steve did a fantastic job in this gap analysis and being very precise what he and his organization wants to know. And then in the end, you have study interpretation. If you click one more time, in between is the mechanics of doing these types of studies, the real world evidence studies. Next slide, please. Let's dissect this a little bit, and I really sympathize with John Whitney's comment from Anthem, the complexity that we see in these studies, and it doesn't need to be complex. That is what I want to communicate here. We have just three layers. Next click, please. A design layer, a measurement layer, and an analytic layer. In the design layer, you analyze the study question and you pick a study design that fits to the study question in order to answer the study question. You decide between a controlled study or a self-controlled study. You identify the target population that will answer your question. You have patient and physician-informed outcomes. You have biologically informed effect windows. And then we have some little tricks here and there about bias reduction strategies in study design choices, given the nature of the data not having been collected for research purposes, but by running a healthcare system, right? The next layer, please click, is a not very glorious layer, but it's one of the most important layers, the measurement layer. Nobody's ever got a Nobel Prize, not that an epidemiologist has ever got a Nobel Prize, but certainly not in this area, but it is the gasoline in the car, right? And the measurement layer is where a lot of confusion happens. And we can simplify that layer by saying that we need 4 types of variables in order to run these real-world evidence studies. We need to identify the exposure, the device, maybe very specifically what type of device. We need to identify the outcome. We need to identify the outcome with certain measurement characteristics, with certain sensitivity parameters and specificity parameters. We need to identify confounding factors, pre-exposure patient characteristics in the absence of baseline randomization in order to do statistical adjustment strategies. And of course, we need to identify the population of interest. And this can be done in the small print above these white arrows. You see examples of where information comes from. This can come from claims data with diagnosis code, procedure code, etc. These might be biomarkers. In oncology, we often need biomarkers to identify the very narrow population, and these might be other factors. Then once we have identified these measurements, next click please, we come to the analytics layer, where we then compare the incidence rates between the 2 groups that we're comparing, and the focus is very much on achieving balance in the 2 groups that we're comparing in the absence of baseline randomization, okay? There are plenty of methods there. What is important, I think I want to underline here, is that we want to do sensitivity analysis to check the robustness of our findings. Next slide. There is an enormous dynamism right now in the area of real-world evidence, particularly in the pharmaceutical space, but also the device space. One important question comes up: how reproducible are these studies, right? If you click 1, 2, 3 times now, there are pilot studies with 32 replications, and now there's a study that we are about to finish here at Harvard, where we have identified 150 published real-world evidence studies, and we are reproducing those studies in the same data in order to illustrate, well, how reproducible are these findings in the same data? And what comes out of that is, well, it's a glass half full, half empty thingy. I like to see it half full, that we can do much better in reporting, in the clarity of reporting. Is back to Dr. Whitney's comment about clarity, transparency, and also structure. So from that, we derived, in together with regulators across the world and the industry consortium, a structured reporting template of the parameters that we need to know for us to fully understand what the investigators did, because only once you understand what was done can you make an assessment of the validity of the study, which we ultimately want to do. And there's a lot of professional societies and others that are involved in this standard setting process. And that is quite active right now and really, really important. Next slide, please. Once we have bought in that this study is reproducible and the investigator did what they promised to do, then there's still a question about how valid is the study. And if you click 3 times now, one of the projects that I'm very much involved in is FDA-funded RCT duplicate, where we are identifying 30 randomized trials that were used by the agency or were planned to be presented to the agency for medication approval or supplemental indications. And we try to emulate those randomized trials with the claims data and see whether we can come to the same conclusion. And there we have developed a structured process of how to do this in a very transparent way, where we can share the data analytic environment with the stakeholder, with the FDA. We have an analytic platform that is most transparent and allows audit trails to check who did what when. Was there peeking at the results and then the analytic strategy was changed because we didn't like the results? All that can be now audited. And then that leads to graphics like that you see in the lower left corner there, where we then see how well are we doing. The bottom line is we're doing quite well if the data are detailed enough and complete enough. Next slide, please. This is what we learned from Steve Farmer. The gap analysis is critical here. So the interest is very much in hard clinical endpoints, long-term endpoints, in some important subgroups. So next slide, please. When we are tasked with this, the first thing, what is a very healthy exercise, is to contemplate the randomized trial that you would like to do had you have unlimited resources with regard to money, but also with regard to time. And what most of the time comes to mind is the classical parallel group randomized controlled trial, and that's the upper left corner. We have identified a patient of interest. You randomize them into, here, the device group or the comparator group. And most of the time in device epidemiology, you have a non-user group, right? Device versus not device. Rarely do you have one device against another device. I think we had this with hip implants. But in pharmacoepi, often we are dealing with active comparators. Most of the time we do have a reasonable alternative. That is different device epidemiology. In the lower left corner, then you see the translation of the parallel group randomized controlled trial into a non-randomized design, which is the cohort study. Every randomized trial is a cohort study after the day after randomization, right? Well, in a cohort study, we don't have randomization. You see this little S replacing the R for randomization, S for selection. Patients self-select themselves together with their physicians, and insurance, into getting the device or not getting the device, okay? And next slide, please. What I want to highlight is, can you click one more time, please? There you go. When you have a non-user comparison group and you don't have baseline randomization, that is something that is a tough exercise for us epidemiologists. We like active comparators because the treatment selection might be so strong. This is an example by a colleague of mine, Soko Setoguchi, when she was with us. She's now at Rutgers. Where she was comparing implantable cardioverter defibrillators, ICDs, against medical treatment in patients with heart failure. Let me describe the diagram on the left side there. The outcome here is 30-day all-cause mortality. The red dotted line is the defibrillator. Day 0 is the day of implementation, of implantation. The green line is medical treatment, and the index date there was some calendar match date, right? And what you see is that the 30-day all-cause mortality, the risk is jumping up right away. And when you see figures like that, the alarm bells need to go off that this is most likely just confounding acting, because those patients who don't have a very good life expectancy, they will not be offered the ICD, right? There's a surgical risk involved and implantation risk and all that. And therefore, people who are close to death's door will not get the opportunity to get the device. And that's exactly what we see here. You could argue, well, the ICDs are so powerful and therefore people don't die, which is why we turn to the right side where we look at admissions to skilled nursing home facilities, and we see exactly the same picture. This enormously strong selection towards healthier patients receiving the device. This is the challenge that we need to overcome in our example. Next slide, please. So this is now my attempt to kind of design a study in order to fulfill Steve Farmer's wishes in additional evidence. And let's go step by step. Next slide, actually. There are 4 columns here. The left column is design aspect, then comes a randomized trial, how we would design a randomized trial if we could and would. The next column is what we do in a real evidence study, and the last column is the measurement issues. The real world evidence study cannot be disentangled from the measurement issues. This goes so closely together, so we need to talk about this together. Population, as set forth, was 65 plus, type 1 diabetes largely, probably difficult to control diabetes. You would mimic the same in a real world evidence study. These patients are very well identifiable, except who are the people with difficult to control diabetes? That is a bit tricky in claims data. And I do assume that we have Part D patients with us where we do see the pharmaceutical dispensing. We do see that they have insulin dispensing. The subgroups of interest, racial ethnic minorities, multiple comorbidities, that is very well recorded in CMS data. We record the racial composition, ethnic information, and comorbidities can be identified using diagnosis code. We do this all the time. So I don't see any issues here. Next slide, please. We need to now identify the exposure in a comparison group. The artificial pancreas, I assume we can identify through CPT codes. There's a procedure code. Somebody needs to implant this thing, and that generates that code, and it should be very much identifiable with high sensitivity and specificity. The comparison group, well, it's insulin treatment. These are type 1 diabetes patients. While we can see the insulin dispensing, the challenge that I see here is that we don't know the exact dosing. We see the strength of the insulin, how many units were dispensed, but we don't know the exact indications, like dosing per kilogram weight and things like that. We don't have that information claims data. And the time zero is also not clear to me. Time zero for the pancreas, artificial pancreas is straightforward. It's the day of implementation. Time zero for the insulin is not quite clear. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the outcome of interest, these are major cardiovascular events, including cardiovascular death. It is declining renal function. End-stage renal disease might be one of the endpoints. Another endpoint might be device failure, explantation of the device, and we have also self-efficacy in a gap analysis. The MACE endpoints are well captured in claims data. These are hospitalizations for an MRI, hospitalizations for acute coronary syndrome and things like that, stent implantation. Cardiovascular death can be identified with the NDI linkage, National Death Index. End-stage renal disease is well captured in Medicare. These dialysis therapy, hemo or peritoneal. The removal of the device should also be well recorded. The self-efficacy, that is an interview study, most likely with the patient. So that is not done in claims data. We have to reach out to the patients of before and after implant of the device. Next slide, please. The pre-exposure covariates, the so-called confounders, well, we don't need to deal with that in a randomized trial. We have baseline randomization, the real-world evidence study. We need to identify all the predictors for MACE, cardiovascular death, predictors for renal failures. Confounding factors are risk factors for the outcome of interest that are also driving the exposure, right? And whenever we have death in the outcome of interest, like cardiovascular death, there's so many pathways to death that I'm quite worried whether we will be able to overcome the confounding here, despite high-dimensional confounding control with proxy variables. And I'll talk in a second about that. Next slide, please. Thank you. The analytic strategy is actually fairly straightforward. The follow-up model would be the follow-up starts the day after the implantation till either an event, death, or 5 years of follow-up, and you mimic that in a real-world evidence study. The analysis of the RCT would be intention to treat, I would assume, with the Cox proportional health source model. In real evidence study, we mimic that. We do an as-started analysis. We might want to do propensity score matching, for example, 1-to-4 matching, oversampling the non-users. I assume that we have few people with artificial pancreas and many without. There are quality checks like protocol registration before you start the analysis. So this is kind of the outline of the study that I would propose. Next slide, please. The challenges that I see, the challenges that I see are around confounding. Can we overcome the confounding when we have a non-user comparator group? We would spend quite a bit of thinking around that. I'm worried that only people with a reasonable life expectancy receive that device and others won't. So there could be very strong selection going on. And how can we overcome that? A side point is competing risks. If people die faster at higher proportions, these are elderly patients with a severe condition, we need to deal with that. What happens to patients with transplants, kidney pancreas transplants? It's not that frequent, I was told, so maybe it's not an issue really. I would be very worried, if this would be real, would be very worried about study size. If you look at MACE endpoint, I think we're talking thousands of patients, not hundreds or tens of patients. Next slide, please. It's just a side note about proxy adjustment as an example in diabetes research where we compare two oral anticoagulants, antidiabetic medications, and we adjust for more than 100 pre-exposure covariates with a propensity score matching strategy in these claims data, but we still have in the green box a range of parameters that we simply don't observe in claims data. Is BMI, smoking status, duration of diabetes. These are things that we just don't measure directly. But just the fact that you adjust for a whole bunch of proxy measures, we call them proxies in claims data, leads to also implicitly adjusting for factors that you don't observe. And you see this in the green box at the right bottom there, right on the right side, where after matching on the observable claims data, the gray stuff, we also achieve balance in the green stuff that we don't observe and that we don't measure in claims data, just in a subgroup where we have electronic health records. And you see beautiful balance in that. And that is the power, I'm showing this to you only, that is the power of having active comparator. This is one antidiabetic versus another antidiabetic, right? In non-users, it's trickier. And my last slide, please. Overall, I think that the study design issues are the most important threat to validity, really, in non-inertial real-world evidence studies in general. Contemplating the target trial helps you a lot to avoid mistakes, helps you a lot in communicating your findings, and just thinking straight through and making things less complicated than it often is portrayed as. Number 2, please. Next slide. Next click. The measurement issues when you work with these secondary data need a lot of attention, right? You need to be aware that you're not in control of what to measure, how to measure, and when to measure. You're trying to piece things together indirectly when you have the secondary data. Can I click twice, please? if number 1 and number 2 are addressed, if they are addressed, if you have an active comparator design, in many cases that I was involved in, we can overcome often the lack of randomization quite well. The situation that we have here, where we have a non-user comparison group, they just remain tricky. And I'm looking forward to the next presentation with some interesting ideas here. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Sebastian. I think it'll be interesting to the audience to hear how two different causal inference people can come at the same issue in significantly different ways. So I will focus on the differences rather than the overlaps in the ways that Dr. Schneeweiss and I would look at this. And then at the end, I'll say something about similarities. So next slide. All right, next slide. That's just me. Let me start with what you want in real-world evidence studies very often is big data, not the 100 people trials that you saw in the artificial pancreas study. And so the first thing I want to emphasize is that we need big data sets, and very often we don't have the ones we need, right? Registries are great, but they're not enough even apart from cost, because they don't include a control group of people who didn't get the device. You can compare two devices, you can compare two drugs, but you can't compare A to not A, right? People who get not A are outside the registry, and even if you're comparing two devices, different physicians at different hospitals are using the different devices, and that's going to correlate with unobserved patient health or hospital physician skill. We need to go beyond registries. We need big data sets. We need to link claims data and EHR data. For devices, you want to capture the device ID somewhere, and you want to do this for really big populations, and Medicare is a start. Next slide. So the US is terrible at this. We are far behind 20 other countries in the world. Claims data, Medicare fee-for-service is often valuable, but it's really hard to get commercial payer data under 65. It's nearly impossible to link the two together. CMS doesn't even collect Medicare Advantage data. Well, maybe that made sense 20 years ago when Medicare Advantage was just starting, but it's now a third of the Medicare universe. Why do we not have Medicare Advantage data? EHR data, electronic health records. There is no consistency across electronic health records. The quip in the EHR space is you've seen one Epic EHR, you've seen one Epic EHR, and have no idea what the next one looks like. Data dictionaries are often incomplete or don't even exist. And you can imagine CMS trying to impose a common data model like the PCORNet model, but we don't have one now. Next slide. We are also terrible at linking across data sets. With rare and slow and expensive exceptions, you can't link Medicare claims to commercial claims, even if both sides agree. You can't link across commercial payers. The commercial payers won't agree. Every state Medicaid data set is different. You can't link claims to EHR, and you can't link either type of data easily to mortality data. One of the absurdities in this space is that CDC collects mortality data and makes it so bloody expensive that researchers can't use it. If you try to link data sets, the IRB process is often hugely more painful than it needs to be. Some IRBs are decent, some are terrible, and it's just random which one you get. Next slide. So COVID was a real eye-opener here. We could run vaccine trials faster than we thought we could. That was a huge success. And so there's a message there about agency industry cooperation for devices. But for everything else, we turned out to be a huge laggard. For real-world vaccine safety and efficacy, if you want to know about Pfizer-BioNTech, ask Israel. Don't ask us because we don't know. If you want to ask about Moderna, well, nobody really to ask because it's mostly used in the US. The only data we have is risk if vaccinated, with no comparative data for the control group of similar people not vaccinated. That's the same problem for devices as comparing A to not A. The CDC can tell you about outcomes for vaccinated people and can tell you nothing about outcomes for non-vaccinated people. If you want to know about the risk of being reinfected if you're already infected, there are studies from a bunch of other countries and nothing from the US. Next slide.
So I want to think of linked quality data sets as healthcare research infrastructure that we need to invest in. We're bad at it. The third job is to get much better. The first job is to recognize how bad we are. We cannot do population-based research at speed, and we often can't do it at all. And then job two is to recognize that we need to get better, that it's really urgent for better quality data, and we're not going to get there with private incentives. The incentives are just not there. So CMS, FDA, CDC can lead if they choose to, but they're going to need to. Just a couple of examples here, right? Government data should be free or nearly free to academic researchers. It is absurd to go get US government funding to buy Medicare data from the government. I have a project where we got $500,000 in funding to buy Medicare data, out of which we used $300,000 to give back to the government, and the rest went to university overhead. Huh? That's crazy. Data sets should routinely include reasonable geographic identifiers like 5-digit zip code. That shouldn't be something special, something that risks re-identification. As long as it's being used in a research space, right? As long as it's being used by people who can maintain data security. And then these non-identifiable data sets, like Medicare claims data, should survive project expiration. We shouldn't have this find another project or you have to destroy your data. Why? I'm at Northwestern. We'll keep the data secure, check our data security, but let us keep the data for the next project. Next slide. Okay. Enough about complaints about the data we don't have. Let me imagine that good data exists. And I want to comment on how to use real-world evidence for an interesting but artificial pancreas example. What data would we want? How could we use it? What research designs would make sense? Next slide. So for the artificial pancreas, what do we need? We need a large sample to detect low-frequency adverse events. We need much bigger sample than the trials. The trials were laughably small. We want to study a whole range of macro outcomes, whatever they are. These are low-frequency outcomes, which reinforces the need for a large sample. These are outcomes that take time to develop, so we're going to need a long time frame, and we're going to have to be tentative about saying, we think this is pretty good, but we're going to have to check again in 2 years and 4 years and 6 years, and we're going to need a way to say, you know what, after we looked at that, after 6 years or 8 years, you know what, it didn't work so well anymore. And that's really hard to do, and we don't know how to do it. Next slide. So I'm going to imagine a real-world trial with feasible data. Steve Farmer imagined a device. I'll imagine a trial. So I'm going to link everything together. I'm going to link claims data. I'm going to link EHR data so I can get HbA1c and glucose and cholesterol and blood pressure. I'm going to link mortality data. Medicare has it, but for cause of death, I want to get NCHS data. I'm going to link it to demographic data. Ideally, I put all the data inside census where they have individual identifiers, but 5-digit zip code is decent. So I could tell whether results vary by race or ethnicity or poverty and so on, which Steve mentioned. And then we need device numbers. So for example, we've got this artificial pancreas. We don't know whether it works on old people. CMS might say we want a big trial. We're going to make everybody age 68 to 73 eligible, but no one else. And once we see results, we might expand the age range. And we can imagine other restrictions. The initial trial was only on ordinary weight people. So let's start with BMI between 25 and 30. Next slide. Why this particular design? It's not unique. I tried to come up with the ideas that work for this example. There will be other design ideas that will work for other examples. Why start at age 68? Answer, so we can use Medicare claims to look back for 3 years and measure comorbidities and make sure that people have similar comorbidities for treated versus control. We can compare age 68 to controls a little bit younger for whom we also have data. Why stop at age 73? Because I want an arbitrary cutoff. It'll let us compare younger elderly to older elderly. Why limit the BMI range? Same idea. We want sharp arbitrary cutoffs. And 2 dimensions of cutoff is better than 1. And where should we start? Why BMI 25 to 30? I don't know. Use what you know about the science to predict who's most likely to benefit. Next slide. So this is, for those of you who don't know the terminology, I'm going to be throwing research design terms at you. They are real terms. They are out there in the literature, even if you don't know them. And given more time, we could provide more detail on each one. This is a regression discontinuity design. This is the observational study design that does best across a variety of fields and replicating the results from a randomized controlled trial. And here's the core idea. People just outside the cutoffs, just younger than 68 or just older than 73, are going to be observationally identical to those just inside, except for the running variable. Here, the running variables are age and BMI. And we can use regression to control for the running variables. Inside the cutoffs, we have an intent to treat design. Not everybody offered the device will take it. And we can use whether you're inside the cutoff as an instrumental variable for whether you actually get the device. To be sure, we need high take-up among those eligible for study power. We don't want you to offer the device to 100 people and have one of them take it, because that's going to kill the power of your design. Next slide. Results will be valid outside the box, just not too far. Whatever results we find for age 68 to 73 will carry over to younger and older, just not too far. To 74, 75, 76, yes. To 89, no. Whatever results we find for BMI from 25 to 30 will carry over to lower and higher BMI, just not too far. To 31, 32, 33, yes. To 45, no. You can use variation within the box by age and BMI to predict what variation you expect outside and then see if you get it. And then over time, you can exploit the time dimension. CMS can say, okay, in 2 years, we'll expand the upper bound to 75. In 4 years, we'll expand the upper bound to 77. We can expand the BMI range as well. This is going to be a variation on what's known as a stepped wedge design. Next slide. Even better, within the RD box, randomize. It can be crude randomization. This doesn't have to be very careful. First you sign up, then we randomly pick just first letter of your last name. I don't care. Then you've got a randomized control trial within the box and an RD design at the edges. Within the box, you can block randomize by gender, by race or ethnicity. If poor minorities are hard to reach, you can use stronger encouragement. What else can you think about? You can think about a crossover design. If you only some people inside the box are eligible, make the controls eligible after 2 years, or half eligible after 2 years and the rest after 4 years. You can look at time variation, early versus later treated, right? The treatment effects vary with time since implantation. Next slide. So somehow I had a picture with a box on it, and that's missing here. What happened to that? Can you go back a couple of slides? Yeah, you skipped over that. This is the RD box, okay? So here's the idea. Inside the box, you're eligible. Maybe randomized, ideally randomized, maybe not. Inside the inner box. The outer box is people who are going to be observationally similar, except on these two dimensions, except on the running variables, except on BMI and age. We control for those with regression, okay? And so the core idea is if you're BMI 24.5, you look just like someone who's BMI 25.5, as long as we control for BMI. And therefore, the estimates we get for people inside the box carry over outside the box. Okay, so jump over to the last slide. Yeah, so broad idea here, let me take a step back if I can, is you start out with a clinical trial, but you know that the real world is coming. We can ask device manufacturers, design your observational study up front. Do it prospectively. Don't just go find some treated and control persons after the fact. Yes, propensity score matching and reweighting is better than nothing, but you can do better. Different types of designs will call, different types of devices will call for different designs. There are multiple design ideas for observational data that are available. And there are good causal inference researchers who can help with the design. On the whole, epidemiologists and RCT people don't really know this. It's just not something they've done. Once you've done this, Register the study up front as you would for a clinical trial. We've learned about operating in parallel in COVID space. Design the observational trial while you're still in the clinical trial. Work with FDA, work with CMS, get them to agree on the study design, and you can do all this in parallel with working on your trial and seeking the trial-based FDA approval. The worst that happens is you spent some money on a few people to design the trial. The cost of that relative to the cost of the clinical trial is negligible. And the idea then is when the device is approved, the observational study is ready to go. And there, COVID is a great example. We learned how to do that. And then you wait and you look at the real world. And one thing I would now add is, in response to Sebastian, is once you've done your observational study, have someone else try to replicate it. Go get Sebastian to replicate your study and see if it actually replicates. Because what we've learned in many areas is maybe they do, and maybe they don't. And if I were going to try to replicate one of these observational studies, I'd say, FDA and CMS, you go pick the researchers. I don't want the manufacturer to pick the researcher to do the replication. You go pick somebody who you're convinced is totally independent, get them the data, and let's see what replicates and what doesn't. Thank you. So we have some time for questions. We deliberately moved relatively quickly, and so
did. Thank you very much. So, Steve, do you want to react to the challenges that were presented by Sebastian and Bernie?
So firstly, to answer the question that was posed in the chat just verbally, there were 3 hard outcomes that were referenced in the gap analysis. And you don't necessarily need to hit all 3 of them, but you do need to demonstrate that there's an improvement in hard outcomes. Many studies have not yet incorporated patient-reported outcome measures. That's largely aspirational in many contexts, but certainly one that's an outcome that we would love to see more of, because it really reflects that whatever intervention it is that is being studied actually is of interest and benefit to patients directly. The second question that was posed in the chat earlier was about where does real-world evidence come in the process of evidence development. And from my perspective, particularly for an implanted device, it's hard to imagine that the FDA would authorize that. They may have provided some examples earlier, but in many instances, they will require a conventional randomized controlled trial to achieve FDA market authorization. Where I think real-world evidence could really shine is in expanding the generalizability to a real-world context beyond that very curated clinical trial scenario, where you have a broader range of patients included, a broader range of settings included, and you can demonstrate that the benefit of the device really extends to the Medicare population and also other underrepresented minority patients.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I think another point that Dr. Whitney alluded to a bit earlier, I have myself a lot of questions about the transferability of a well-controlled randomized trial to the real world and the results that can be obtained, particularly when the device or the technology has a significant component of the surgeon or cardiologist or other provider responsible for the placement or adjustment or accuracy of placement. All those things can enter into it. It's a very different environment than medications, which certainly have their own challenges in the pharma research world of compliance and a number of other variables. But when you add in the additional changes that occur when a trial where the surgeons or cardiologists or others have been very carefully trained and proctored and monitored in that environment, and now you move it to something more of a wild, wild west, where I know from my own experience that interventional type physicians are always excited about bright, shiny new objects and want to try them. And that may or may not come with the necessary training, and not just in the skills of placing the device, but also, most important, patient selection. And in a trial, those are very, very well controlled. So it's a big jump to the real world. And while John Whitney did note that randomized controlled trials are real world evidence and data, there is a significant opportunity for new variation to be introduced.
Yeah, completely agree with that. Yeah.
Bernie, I'm sorry.
One question that I'm interested in asking both Bernie and Sebastian is your experience with publishing causal inference designs in the peer-reviewed medical literature, and in particular using the words causal inference, because Bernie and I have published previously together, and our experience has been that journal editors are wanting to modify all the language in the manuscript to associations and not causal anything. And that necessarily sort of diminishes the potential impact of the publication. So can you both speak to that? You probably have different experiences given your different areas of expertise.
Yeah, so I differentiate between kind of causal inference in the most narrow sense, kind of what Miguel Hernan and Jamie Robbins are doing here across the street, versus, we want to get to causal conclusions. We all want that. As soon as you have a 2x2 table epidemiology, right, you infer some sort of causality, otherwise you don't do this associative analysis, right? And the rest is wordsmithing, right? Whether you call it an association or a causal relationship, in the end, the reason why you do this is because you want to act upon those findings. Otherwise, it's just numbers and colorful graphs, right? So when we publish, we're careful with using the words causality. So I use the word usually causal conclusions rather than causal inference to mitigate that, and I seem to fare quite well with that.
So, yeah, this is an issue in terms of reaching the medical audience, that the medical journals want to say A is associated with B, even if you have a study design that may not lock down that A causes B, but it provides strong evidence that A causes B. And I don't have a good solution to that, frankly. It is an issue. I was going to say a bigger problem that I found, and I don't know what Sebastian's experience with, is I think that the replication work that he described is enormously important and enormously hard to publish. It's just not interesting to journal editors on the whole, right? And I've had more than one experience of sending a paper to a journal that basically demolishes a paper that journal publishes, and they say, we're not interested. And another journal says, we're not interested because it was in that journal. This is a real challenge, and it is a challenge at the level of the journal and the journal editors, because if the journals aren't taking this work, then not enough people are going to do it.
Yeah, and this just building on that, based on the RCT duplicate project that I described, where we tried to emulate 30 RCTs. For the emulation, we used 3 database studies, so three of these claims data, Medicare claims data, and 2 commercial. And what is most interesting, actually, is to see the variation in effect estimates between the 3 databases. And whenever we have discussions with our colleagues from the agency, I can see this in their brain spaces saying, look, gosh, we got to see more than one database whenever we look at database studies, because we need to understand the variability that we see here. And this is not a biologic variability. It is highly unlikely. Let's put it that way. It's highly unlikely. There are very few biologic factors that lead to strong treatment effect modification, right? Most likely, these are measurement issues. These are recording issues in the data that lead to these differences in the point estimates. And when I started out in pharmacoepidemiology 25 years ago, well, we were happy that we did a study in one database, and whatever that was the finding. With the ubiquitousness of data sources, with the scalability of the analytic infrastructure that we have with these software platforms that are connected with these data sources, right? It's so much easier now to do multi-database studies. And we'll see this more and more often now, the variability between data sources, right? So I cannot stress that enough, that these reproducibility issues are really, really important.
So thank you. We are very, very happy to have a guest with us, a true expert in this area around data quality, data standardization. As Pamela mentioned at the outset of the program, in describing MDIC, the NEST organization under Sandy Siami has really led this effort. And I'm going to turn to Sandy now to talk a little bit, respond a little to some of the questions and points about data standardization and quality, and also, I hope, a plug for UDI.
Of course, and hopefully you guys can hear me, and it's a pleasure. And I have to say, Bernie, I'm with you in a lot of the comments that you made, and NEST is certainly trying to solve some of those issues and challenges that we have. One of the things, let me just start with our research network, because we couldn't do the work that we do without our collaborators and our researchers and the entire community within NEST and that ecosystem to move along the use of the different real-world data sources. And to Sebastian's point, the beauty of NEST is that we have access to multiple different health systems and multiple different data sources to try to bring them together. Our major challenge, plug for UDI, is that data linkage and identification of the right devices, right? And so our initiatives within UDI, and Bob Giffen, who's our director of research, is leading that effort under NEST. And that's going to be key to be able to identify these. And certainly, I love the idea of RCT replicate, and we're doing that with pharma, and how can we leverage that for devices? And we have so many different types of challenges with devices that we don't have with pharmaceuticals or even biologics. The next thing is common data models. So we have different health systems use different data models, different research networks use different data models. How can we help transform, translate one data model to another? We certainly don't want to create a new CDM, right? So what can we use, and what tools do we have to translate those different data models into one that we can work with? And so that's one of the things that NEST is working on, especially for active surveillance, but obviously we can use it within our research environment. And then data quality is key. Not just data quality, actually, the research methods. And so NEST has been charged with developing frameworks for research methods, for data quality, of what is that fit for purpose that we need to do? What's that right fit for purpose study design? What's that right data quality that we need, depending on the study that we have? And certainly there's gaps between what we would do for regulatory decision-making versus coverage decisions, right? And that's the next step of NEST. Certainly we started focusing on the regulatory submissions, but our pivot is how can we help close that gap?
Great. Thank you, Sandy. So we have a number of other participants who are available for comments and questions, and I appreciate everybody's participation here. I want to welcome Eleanor Perfetto, representing our many patient advocacy organizations in the country. And Eleanor, I know you didn't have a lot of advance warning for this, so very much appreciate your joining us today. But please jump in if you think there's a point where you would like to comment. Do you have any reaction? You don't have to You don't have to say anything right now, but do you have a reaction to the hypothetical example and how that was approached and what?
I actually do. I actually do. So one of the things that is a benefit for me in jumping into this at the very last minute that I did is that I'm also trained as a pharmacoepidemiologist, and Sebastian and I know each other. But one of the things that I think it's kind of interesting about the example being a diabetes example, and I really want to start with talking about what Steve said about the missing information about what patient preferences are and those patient-reported outcomes. So from that patient advocacy perspective, it's always this idea of beginning with getting information from patients about what they care about most. So if we really want to construct the perfect study, and I think we've talked a lot about the methodology here that would go into the ideal study, one of the very first steps is making sure that we, as the researchers, or either collect ourselves or find the existing information about what patients have said is most important to them in the way the disease or the treatments impact their daily life. And so ideally, that would be a great way to go. And so very often we think about that when we think about medical product focused development, that doing it in a patient-centered way, but we don't give it a lot of thought when it comes to real world evidence. And interestingly enough, they can be very, very well connected. So in constructing the studies, yes, you would want to be sure that you're constructing the study to capture the data that patients have told you is most important to them, those outcomes and the other impacts on their life, because very often that gets very beyond health outcomes. And you want to collect those impacts on their life when they are the things that are most important to patients. And then also, so that's kind of the upfront part, constructing that study, but also thinking about how learning information from that information from patients can help you in designing a real world evidence study and in interpreting the data that comes out of a real world evidence study. So while this example is not directly relevant to the case, it helps bring home what I'm talking about. We did some work with patients who have atrial fibrillation. And if you talk to atrial fibrillation patients and find out when they're first diagnosed, very often it took many years of misdiagnosis before they finally got to an accurate diagnosis. So if you began in a real world database with the date of the first time you see the diagnostic code of atrial fibrillation, you could very well be at least a couple of years off, and sometimes 7, 8, 9, 10 years off from when those symptoms actually began. So your analysis could be that far off because that conversation with patients, if you didn't have it, you wouldn't know that they had gone through these misdiagnoses of anxiety or gastrointestinal and all these other things that were misdiagnoses. Though getting that kind of information can help really refine the data strategy in terms of articulating who the patient population is, what your timeline is going to look like, how you are going to operationalize what the outcomes are. All of those kinds of things can be refined by getting information from patients about what their experiences have been. And then in the end, when you do have the findings from your study, also having that insight from patients can help you in the interpretation of the findings that you got, because patients can help you figure out, oh, well, yes, I believe that result because of these things that I know happened to me in my experience, or maybe that's not quite right because I see it this way or that way. So these are very useful things that can contribute. And we've been working on a project the last year and a half with representatives from ISPOR and ISP and putting together some principles that can be useful to real-world evidence researchers, real-world data analysis on how they can incorporate patient centricity into the work that they're doing. And so we will be putting that out. Hopefully sometime this summer, we'll have that final document ready. And we're happy to share that because we think it's an important aspect. And I think just to put it in context, and that this does relate to the example that you gave, if we all believe that we know what patients are looking for and what's important to them without asking them, then I just have one word for you to think about, and that's exubera.
All right. I'm glad I don't know what that is.
Exubera is a diabetes product that failed miserably because there wasn't enough work done to understand whether or not patients wanted it.
Yeah, excellent. All right. Thank you, Eleanor. So we did receive a question from the audience. Gordon, welcome. I'm glad you were able to join. And the question has to do with the outcomes data and real-world evidence for therapeutic devices compared to diagnostics. And that is a complicated question. We have a couple of experts in the panel who will take a quick stab at it. Turn to Sean Tunis first for FDA on that question, and then Steve.
Yeah, no, that is a good question, and I think, you know, typically one of the contrasts in diagnostics versus therapeutics is even though you know, CMS will in their criteria for reasonable necessary diagnostics states that there has to be a beneficial impact on patient outcomes in order to demonstrate clinical utility. There's also you know, sort of the lesser standard of the diagnostic information having an impact on clinician decision making or patient decision making. So if a change in decision making can be plausibly linked to a potential improvement in outcomes, you know, that may often be adequate in the context of diagnostics. Ideally, of course, studies that actually demonstrate that changes in decision making lead to better outcomes is ideal. I would say from you know, from an FDA perspective, obviously the key focus for diagnostics is on diagnostic performance, you know, sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, et cetera, which, you know, again, can be plausibly linked in many cases to better decisions and better outcomes. But, you know, tends to be that in the regulatory context, clinical validity with potential clinical utility is where the regulatory framework applies.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Steve, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think the complexity of the question is, particularly for diagnostics, that they could be used in many different ways and be very impactful in some circumstances and not in others. And that's difficult to capture in a clinical study. And here also illustrates, as Sean mentioned, the distinction between how the FDA views them and how CMS might view them. And so the FDA needs to prove that it does what it says it does reliably, so the sensitivity and specificity of a diagnostic test are demonstrated, whereas CMS would say it doesn't really matter if you have a highly sensitive and specific test if it has no utility. It doesn't change clinical decision-making, the information is not valued, it doesn't relate in any way to outcomes. So that's the challenge. The question is an incredibly complicated one to try to unpack. But those are the main points.
Great. Thank you, Steve. So, Sandy, I want to come back to you with a provocative question. Obviously, right now, we don't know what will happen with the MCIT rule, if there are going to be changes, if it will be delayed, if it will take effect, whatever. But if we make the assumption that certainly in a breakthrough device category for FDA, the number of studies, the long-term outcomes, a lot of data that everybody would like to see are going to be limited. Do you envision a point in time, and perhaps take a stab at when, NEST might be in a position to assume some responsibility for many, or certainly the highest risk items in that category?
NEST has been working in the last few years since initial funding on laying the basic groundwork, right? 2021 is going to be a banner year for NEST in that we are moving towards and changing kind of our focus now from the building blocks to what we can actually execute. And so I think MCIT are and doing the real world studies through on breakthrough devices. I think NEST will be very soon equipped to be able to execute those sorts of studies. That's what we are building up to execute, not just for regulatory decision making, but again, those coverage, health technology assessments, other economic, health economic kind of studies, even clinical decision making, having value to health systems serving for patient safety reporting, for example, and that evidence generation, really building our network, our core collaborators that, and I'll call them our inaugural collaborators, have really helped us dig into that science. There's still a lot of work to do, but the passion of the entire ecosystem that comes to the table, we're looking to accomplish these things. So you will be seeing actually this year and in the next couple of months, many new things that NEST will be rolling out and announcing. And we've, breakthrough devices and doing work with payers is one of them. Certainly we are working on our frameworks to be those playbooks that we will use for our studies, both for the work that we've done has laid the basis for that relevance and reliability that Felipe was talking about a little bit earlier. And so it's not just about the device use or study population, but what is that quality control? What is that quality assurance? To be able to say quality evidence by design is not just a tagline. That's what we're striving to do.
Keep forgetting to unmute myself before I try and start talking. It's going to be the most common phrase of the year. You're unmute. So thank you. Appreciate that. Steve, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say the breakthrough technologies circumstances, it really illustrates the application of real world evidence, right? So if real world evidence is secondary analysis of data collected for another purpose, so you're leveraging that secondary data, the breakthrough therapy or the breakthrough device circumstance is one in which you could not use breakthrough or real world evidence for the initial approval because there would be no passively derived data available for it, right? So it's an illustration of a circumstance where you have to do a randomized controlled trial in a evidence development phase for regulatory approval, but then you use a post-market environment where it is in use to do an analysis of what are the outcomes in its real-world application.
Let me just, sorry, Joe Carroll, let me just kind of follow up on Steve's comment because he makes a really good point, right? But we talk about, and when you hear Jeff talk and Jeff Shuren speak, and he's talking about using real world evidence in that total product life cycle. So total product life cycle to me is the moment we do the first in man study to the moment we sunset. And certainly in randomized controlled trials, even in first in man where it's not available, what we can do is help utilize the data that we are collecting in the real world to help supplement the data we have to collect in a randomized clinical trial setting. Reduce the burden on the sites. Instead of entering the same information in the EHR, in a registry, and then on a stupid case report form, let's streamline that process, right? And that's, is it innovative? It may not be, but we need to find different ways to use some of this stuff and reduce error, reduce burden. And that's So when I say we can do that, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. And I think that was a point that Steve made earlier. Registries, while they may be viewed as just a fantastic tool, and the TVT registry for the transcatheter aortic valves was the initial example. And I think it sets a gold standard for what can be done, but an enormous investment for all parties involved to make that happen and make it successful, and not really a sustainable, scalable model for what we hope to accomplish with a lot of innovative technologies being accelerated and brought to patient care as quickly as possible. So that does remain a challenge. I know we're going to run short on time here. Want to see if any of the other individuals who are on my screen have a comment. You can just wave and I'll call upon you. I do have some thoughts in closing. First, I want to thank MDIC for sponsoring this. I think this was a really great discussion today. And I know that there are some questions that are still lingering out there. We can go into more depth on the therapeutic and diagnostic point at some time. And we can also go into deeper detail once we have some further information about the direction of the current administration. Sebastian, did you want to make a comment?
Oh, there was a comment on common data models by the audience, right? And just want to briefly touch on that. The common data models are necessities because you work with many different data sources, you have different recording practices. Nobody wants them, but we need them in order to be efficient. The trouble with common data models is that you also need to preserve the granularity of the information. So I'm sure you're aware of the Sentinel common data model, for example, that we work day in, day out with, that preserves the information because we have so little information, we have nothing that we can give away and lose. So just a word of caution when it comes to these mapping common data models, where you map information to constructs or to some higher entities, because that by definition you lose information. You still need the ability to go deep to the root or underlying data. And we see this day in, day out when we present studies to the FDA. Actually, they want to know exactly what codes you used at the very bottom, how the data were generated. So I'm sure these are fun conversations that you have, Sandy.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Yeah,
So,
Joe Carroll, just a quick,
yes.
I just wanted to kind of take up again some of the comments that Amy made at the beginning of this call, which is just to express a lot of appreciation to Tamara and Steve and Lee Fleischer for, kind of embarking in, a series of conversations about potential use of real world data, particularly around breakthrough technologies. And I think listening to Bernie and Sebastian and Sandra, you really get a sense that there's a moment arising where some of the data quality and the methods are really maturing in a way that I think it can support some of the, the aspirations to better align decision making between FDA and CMS. So there's a lot of work to do, and but I think what's encouraging, and I appreciate MDIC bringing everybody together. Is what's encouraging is I think there's a level of commitment to trying to work through these issues that I think will will result in some progress going forward. So anyway, appreciate the forum and all the goodwill towards trying to sort this out.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And for those in the audience that are not very familiar with MDIC, that really is at the core of the mission to convene the various perspectives and parties that can help move these things forward. And I think that this is a tremendous opportunity. Those of you that aren't familiar with MDIC, I would encourage you to surf around the website, take a look at some of the many recordings and documents that are available there. You do not have to be a member to access the content. So there's no login required. And we would appreciate your feedback on anything you find. And if you're interested in learning more, happy to support that. The other thing I wanted to share is that we are hoping that we can continue to sponsor this kind of conversation going forward to help CMS, other payers be as familiar as possible with the various data sources that may be relevant to the decisions they're making, and really appreciate the participation we already have from CMS and the work we're doing. And then in closing, I want to share that there was a really interesting article, not about healthcare data, real world evidence in healthcare decisions, but a month ago in the New Yorker, authored by a woman named Hannah Fry, What Data Can't Do. And it was an interesting discussion about data used for other purposes. And the part I found really intriguing were the letters that appeared in this week's issue in response to that article. So I'm going to read to you a couple of quotes here. We are left to find a happy medium between two extremes espoused by the philosopher of science, Abraham Kaplan. That quote is, "If you can measure it, that ain't it." And then by Frank Knight, a founder of the Chicago School of Economics, quote, "If you can't measure it anyway." That's the end of that quote, which I find both of those very provocative. And then the final one is an environmental economist I'd never heard of, but I suspect that others in the panel have, James Gustav Speth, quote, "We tend to get what we measure, so we should measure what we want." So with that, I thank everybody for their participation today, and very much looking forward to continued conversation. Thank you, everybody.